Okay, we're back. We think, we hope, right? We had a little connection issue going down actually to the intertidal zone. So we're going to try this again from up top, and we'll just have to describe it a little bit so that you can get the feel. And the visibility is not great, but you do get an idea of our intertidal zone that we're going to be talking about. So I think where we left off was really what it's like to live in this amazing zone of ocean land combination, right? That's what the intertidal is. It's a really harsh environment. If you can imagine having to deal with tides and waves and sun and being completely submerged and being completely exposed. I think of it as like if you're in a washing machine, you get stuck in a washing machine, you fill it with cold water, fill it with rocks, and put it on the heavy cycle for an hours, right? And then you're taken out and you're put on hot asphalt and a heat wave and baked, right? And then you repeat it every 12 hours. That's what this zone is all about. And because of that, physical complexity means it's really biologically diverse. So I kind of think of the organisms that live there as having to adapt a certain body type or a certain behavior to be able to cope with that variability. And so I call them the tough guys and the flexible ones, right? So you either have to be super tough and have armor or an exoskeleton so that you can handle the pounding of waves, or when you're exposed in the sun, you don't get dried out, right? And so I've got some pictures since we can't be down there. Let's look at that. They're not the best, but they give you an idea, right? So these are owl limpets. This is an armored animal, right? He's got that hard shell so that he can handle the pounding waves. And then when the low tide comes in, he sucks in close to the rock and conserves his moisture, right? Not very mobile. The crab, on the other hand, has that same exoskeleton, but they can move, right? So when it's low tide and it's baking sun, they just hide in the crevices and keep cool. So those are some adaptations of the tough guys, right? Then we have the flexible ones. I even have some live samples too. The flexible ones are the ones that kind of go with the flow, right? They move with the waves and the tides. But their biggest concern is get dried out during that low tide. So these anemones, they close in, they reduce their surface area, which reduces their moisture being lost. And they wait for the tide to come back in. The different types of seagrasses and seaweeds, they actually are amazing. They can lose 90% of their water and wait for the tide to come in. So they're adapted to actually lose and dry out and then rehydrate basically when the tide comes in. So they're amazingly adapted to this zone of being submerged and exposed, right? That's that part of the diversity of kind of the tough guys and the flexible ones. I think I brought some other samples of, I'm going to just get them right behind me. Here's some of the diversity of plant life. We've got some seagrass right here. These are the go with the flow guys. We have some Turkish washcloth is what we call it. One of the other plants that is in this intertidal zone. I'm not exactly sure what this is. But I mean, this was just on the beach, right? So there are over 1,000 different species that call this intertidal zone here in Central California, that call it home. It's amazingly diverse for a relatively narrow band of habitat along our coast. It's pretty exciting, I think. So we also have, so there's different zones in this intertidal. There's the low tide zone, which is basically submerged the majority of the time. That's where your anemones, your sea urchins, your sea stars live, and it's only exposed during very extreme low tides. Right now, we're looking at kind of a mid-tide, if you will, right? And this mid-level, this is where those tough guys, the mussels, the limpets, live because they're submerged half the time and exposed half the time, right? So they can handle being exposed to the sun a little bit longer. Then we have like the splash zone. Those animals, those organisms have to deal with about 70% of their time being exposed. So those are really tough guys. Those are the chitons, the snails that can move, the ones that you can, if we were down there, you could see the really tough guys exposed on all these rocks that you can see poking out of the water right now. A lot of the smaller snails, the chitons, the limpets, they're the ones living in this high tide zone. So 3 different zones in that one habitat. And then we have all the species that, if you can imagine, just imagine with me here, when you're looking out over those rocks, there's lots of birds out there on those rocks and harbor seals. We can't see them today because of the marine layer and because of the smoke. But out in that rocky intertidal, these birds depend on this habitat type to rest and to feed. We have populations of birds that breed up in Alaska and come down to the central coast here at Estero Bluffs and other zones in the San Luis Coast District and spend their entire winter feeding in this zone, this intertidal zone, because it is so rich in species for them to feed. They can spend the whole winter here just feeding in these zones. The pelicans and the cormorants and the gulls that are out and terns that are out on those rocks, they're feeding in the ocean, but they need those rocks to come out and rest on. The harbor seals need those rests to haul out, those rocks, to haul out, and they also pup out there too. So the harbor seals have their pups on those exposed rocks in this intertidal zone. So there's huge biological diversity within the intertidal zone, but then there's huge biological diversity of those species feeding and resting in here. I've got some pictures here. This just shows you some of the diversity of birds in terms of the top bird is a long-billed curlew. Look at that bill, crazy, right? So they're probing in all the little crevices around the rocks to get the little clams and snails, right? And then the bird underneath, the turnstone, again, these are breeding up in Alaska. They come here, they spend the whole winter here. And I like their name, turnstone, because what they do, if you watch them, they sit there and they flip over little rocks and all the different seaweeds, getting the little teeny snails and worms, all the little creatures that live in this intertidal zone. So, I mean, just in terms of bill diversity, it just shows you all the different types of animals that can live and feed in this area. Now, earlier today, when we walked down there, when we lost connectivity, which I don't know if people saw it, but we can't talk about the intertidal zone without talking about the black oyster catcher. Here's a picture, because they're really tough to see. These oyster catchers are in a bed of mussels, which is their preferred food. But this bird here, the black oyster catcher, is what we call an intertidal obligate species. It is the only bird that calls this habitat zone, that uses this habitat zone for its entire life cycle, right? The other birds that we mentioned come from Alaska and come here to feed. This oyster catcher, these birds spend their whole life here. They breed here. They have their nests right on the intertidal rocks. Not ones that are in the splash zone. They're above that high tide zone. So they're above the high tide, but it's still part of the intertidal habitat zone. And then they spend all their time feeding in these mussel beds off those limpets we were talking about. You might say, well, Jodi, how do they eat mussels and limpets if those tough guys are so good at sealing against the rocks and closing up so they don't dry out? Well, you can't really see it here, but this bill, this long orange bill, is like a chisel at the very end. It's got a flat edge, and so they pry off. They get underneath the shells of those limpets and pry them right off the rocks. And for the mussels, they wait until the tide comes in enough for the mussels to open a little bit to feed on the plankton, and they get their bill in right when the mussel opens up just a little bit. It's pretty amazing how adapted they are. And you might say, I thought they ate oysters because they're oyster catchers. Well, some oyster catchers, the American oyster catcher, but do eat oysters. Here on the Central Coast, we do not have oysters in our intertidal zone, and so they do not eat oysters here. So they eat mussels and limpets, but the black oyster catcher is the keystone species here in the intertidal zone. And we did see some earlier. I'm not seeing any right now, but they might fly by because they're really loud and noisy and they like to announce that they're here. So I think it's really important to talk about this narrow habitat zone and some of the threats that occur for this habitat. Like I said, it's between the ocean and the land, so it's almost got double the threats, right? It's got threats from the ocean acidification, ocean warming, ocean rising, oil spills, right? So it has those threats. Then it also has threats from the land, pollution, sediment, and agricultural runoff, invasive species, and threats that are coming from the land. So it's got threats coming from different angles. And the fact, just like today, it's so accessible, right? It is the one marine environment that everybody can access. So that means it's also got threats from human activity, over harvesting. A lot of people know about the abalone over harvesting along the coast of California. Again, because people can just walk on out there. The human activities of coastal development, over recreation. So all of those are also threats for this really narrow habitat intertidal zone. And then we can talk about climate change, right? We mentioned it a little bit with sea level rise, right? As sea level rises, this habitat zone is going to have to move, is going to have to move like onshore, if you will, right? So if you look at the coast of California, 58% of the current intertidal zone is potentially vulnerable to sea level rise, meaning that it would have to be able to migrate onshore or basically be submerged. So that 58% means that half of the haul out areas for elephant seals, for harbor seals, for the nesting oyster catchers would be vulnerable to sea level rise. Other things such as temperature of water, temperature of air with climate change can also impact this zone, right? These species are adapted to the Central Coast. As these temperatures rise, the species composition, it doesn't necessarily mean that that the zone would go away, but the species composition of these intertidal areas would change, right? Like in Monterey Bay in the 1930s, the species composition was very different than what it is today, just because of the slight temperature difference between the water and the air. So climate change also can produce a lot of changes for this intertidal zone. We're really fortunate because we have a lot of scientists studying this zone because it is so biologically diverse and because it represents the land and the sea. A lot of research has gone into this zone, and up in UC Santa Cruz, Dr. Pete Ramundi, he runs the Rocky Intertidal Monitoring Network. He's got teams of scientists that monitor all up and down the Pacific Coast, and it's an amazing amount of data that they've collected. And what it is it's like, we call it benchmark data. He's basically he and a team of a lot of scientists are getting to know what is living there now, he's been doing this since the 80s, since 1980. And so this long-term monitoring is really allowing them to see how things change over time that can be either naturally caused or maybe human induced. And so that long-term data is really critical for us to understand which species are important to protect and which areas are really vulnerable. He's got sites in marine protected areas which are protected and sites that are not protected. So we'll be able to have those comparisons too. So that kind of research is very paramount to our understanding how this zone is going to change through time and how we can best protect it. We also have to mention the black oyster catchers. We mentioned them earlier. but we also have a long-term research project with them statewide. Parks, California State Parks is helping lead a community scientist program where monitors are monitoring the reproductive success of these birds. Basically, the premise is if the birds are doing okay, then that indicates that the intertidal zone is healthy as well, right? Because those birds live entirely in this habitat zone and they need to have food, they need to have places to nest. So if those birds are doing okay, then that shows that our intertidal is doing okay as well. So we're really proud to be a part of that work that's happening statewide for California population of oyster catchers. So the long-term monitoring of the species in the intertidal and those species that are dependent upon it are really critical in our role of protecting this habitat. I do want to say that we also have a lot of rules and regulations for this zone, right? So the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has rules and regulations for how to operate in this zone, right? They control the what, where, when, and how of organisms that you can harvest from this zone. So in the regulations, they're going to say what species you can take, how many you can take, how you can take them. You have to have a California fishing license. You can never use tools to pry animals off, right? There's really strict guidelines on how you can harvest animals and what you can collect. It's also going to tell you where you can do it, right? Our marine protected areas, you cannot harvest or take any organism from those areas, right? So it's really important for people to understand of the rules and regulations in this intertidal zone. And there are changes that happen every year, so you need to make sure that you know what's happening for that particular year. So that's another way we protect this really valuable habitat is through that. So we've got research, we've got regulations that are helping us to protect. And for us as visitors and as park managers, you know, what we can do the most is support agencies and organizations that are doing work in this zone, protecting our, supporting our marine protected areas, supporting organizations like Audubon and NOAA and the Coastal Commission, all of those agencies, park districts that are protecting and helping educate people about these zones. And then as visitors ourselves, you know, we can have good conduct, which is, you know, just observing. You can just sit there for hours and be entertained by the life that is going on in this intertidal zone. You don't need to take it with you. Just observe, watch, learn, take pictures, use iNaturalist, you know, document what you're seeing. Have a great time with that diversity. See how many species you can see, but don't poke and prod and disrupt the animals that are there. Be aware if you're too close to the animals, right? If those oyster catchers are squawking at you, or if the birds are being flushed and, you know, flying away, you're too close. You can observe at a distance, right? So our conduct and how we interact with this zone is one of the best things that we can do to protect this coastal zone. And that's really the exciting thing about Estero Bluffs here, about all of our intertidal zones along the coast of California, is this amazingly unique adapted species that are living on the ocean and the land's edge, that are adapted to the waves, adapted to the tide, adapted to being submerged and dried out. It's just amazing. I love it because there is so much going on here and there's so much diversity in a small area. So I just want to encourage people to come out and enjoy it, learn and be creative of how you can coexist with nature and do your part to protect and spread the knowledge of just the exciting things that live right here at our state parks. And I just encourage people to come to their state parks and enjoy it and have a great time seeing all the rich biodiversity that's right here with us. And so that's really all I wanted to say. And I really encourage, if anyone has questions, write them in and I'll do my best to answer. I'm not going to say I can answer them all, but we love questions because then I can answer what you want to know. So have at it.
While we're waiting for some questions, maybe we'll walk along the bluff and see the view on the north end here.
Okay, let's try that. Let's see if we can keep connectivity. The offshore rocks is part of our California National Monument, and all those offshore rocks, which are really good nesting zone, and we'll see those as we walk on the coast a bit. And we're coming back here for better connection. There's the offshore rocks. We're not going to go up coast. You can see a little bit of the pelicans out there now. I don't know if it's going to pick up. Brown pelicans are here year round, but they're very abundant right now in the summertime. We get hundreds and hundreds of brown pelicans coming up using, this is what we call Estero Bay, the larger Estero Bay. It's incredibly rich with marine organisms, with fish, and so that's why the pelicans come up here and they spend their summer here fishing in this Estero Bay. And if we could see a little closer, there's also cormorants out there, 3 different species of cormorants, harbor seals that are out there resting. We had willets and whimbrels, 2 other bird species. Do you have any questions?
Not yet, Jodi.
No questions coming in. How about you, Robin? Do you have any questions?
So what makes the Central Coast a biodiversity hotspot?
Oh my goodness. I'm not, what makes it a hotspot for me is the Central Coast has such diversity of habitats, right? Right here in San Luis County, we have the San Lucia Mountains, we have the Carrizo Plains, we have beautiful oak forests, we have chaparral, we have coastal scrub, these coastal terraces like here at Estero, and then we have the whole intertidal and dune habitats. So the diversity of habitats is why, the Central Coast is a biodiversity hotspot, because of all the different organisms that live in each of those habitats. It's amazing. Within a couple hours, you can see all those different habitats.
It's a pretty small area, right?
It's a pretty small area. I don't know what that is, but I mean, for that amount of diversity, and that's what makes it a hot spot, right? Is just in a small area, you've got such dense diversity, much like the intertidal. I mean, that's why that intertidal zone is amazing, is because in a small area, the amount of species, the species richness, and the diversity is so great. So each habitat is diverse, and then you put all those different habitats together, and it's like, whoa, biodiversity. That's excellent.
So for those of you not watching the live and watching this in the future, feel free to ask questions in the comments down below, and we'll make sure to answer those. We want to thank everyone for joining us for Biodiversity Week. Again, this is Jodi Isaacs, our State Park environmental scientist. We're here at beautiful Estero Bluffs State Park, exploring the intertidal region here and the biodiversity that exists within it. We're here on the central coast of California, just west of San Luis Obispo, and we are in the San Luis Obispo Coast District. So for those of you just turning in, we're going to take some last questions. Feel free to enter those questions into the chat. Again, for those of you watching this in the future, don't hesitate to ask questions as well. We'll make sure to get those answers to you. But in the